This is not gossip. This is evidence. And if you think you've heard every version of the Meghan story already, every interview, every tear, every carefully worded accusation, then listen closely because what just happened changes the entire frame. The British Broadcasting Corporation has aired a documentary led by Princess Anne. And the reason the world is spiraling is not because it criticizes Meghan Markle. It is because it treats her like a case. Not a celebrity, not a victim. A case. And the most dangerous word in that kind of film is not scandal. It's footage. Because footage does not argue. Footage does not negotiate. Footage does not care about your brand. It doesn't bend for sympathy or trauma language or the fog of public debate. It sits there cold and still waiting for the moment someone finally presses play. That moment has happened. And within hours, the shock wave has moved faster than any palace statement ever could. Headlines did not crawl. They detonated. Calls did not trickle in. They flooded. A network of commentators, lawyers, former staff, and royal analysts began circling the same three questions at the same time. Questions that do not sound like tabloid bait, but like the beginning of a prosecution. What exactly did Meghan do behind those walls? Why did Princess Anne stay silent for so long? And what was so severe that it forced the palace's most disciplined figure to break her own rule? Never feed the media machine just to stop one person from controlling the narrative. Because that is the twist most people are missing. This was never Anne versus Meghan as a personality clash. This was strategy versus strategy, narrative versus evidence. And the documentary's opening makes one thing brutally clear. Princess Anne did not show up to trade insults. She showed up to end a story that, in her view, had been manufactured and weaponized for years. When Anne speaks, she doesn't sound emotional. She sounds procedural, measured, final. The tone of someone who has already reviewed the file, already confirmed the chain of events, already decided the outcome, and is now simply presenting it to the public as an unavoidable conclusion. And then the documentary does what every high-retention, high-impact expose does when it is confident it can prove its point. It doesn't start with opinions. It starts with a breach, a restricted space, a locked object, a loyal staff member whose name has never mattered to the public until now. And a claim so explosive, it immediately reshapes everything that comes after. That the collapse between Anne and Meghan did not begin with culture or misunderstanding, but with an act described as disgraceful, calculated, and most importantly, documented. But before we step into that corridor, before we get to the archive, the red recording light, and the words that allegedly turned a private voice into a weapon, understand what makes this different from every previous wave of royal drama. Meghan's strongest advantage has always been timing. Speak first, define the story first. Frame the institution first. Force everyone else to respond inside your language. That is how narratives win, not by being perfect, but by being early. Princess Anne has now done the one thing Meghan never expected her to do, and has moved first, not with emotion, with receipts. And that is why this moment feels different, not louder, more final. Because the documentary is not asking the public to believe, and it is inviting the public to watch, to listen, to compare the performance to the record. And once you do that, the central illusion collapses. The idea that this entire saga is built on he said, she said. According to this film, it never was. It was always she did, and it was captured. Now, here's the part that should make you uneasy. Whether you support Meghan, dislike her, or have never cared at all, if Princess Anne is willing to go on broadcast and say, in effect, the public has been manipulated, then she is also saying something else without saying it out loud. There are things the palace has been holding back. There are reasons certain doors stayed closed. There are reasons certain staff never spoke. And there are reasons the hardest-working royal famous for silence, discipline, and duty finally decided that silence was no longer a virtue. So ask yourself this. What kind of evidence forces a royal like and to take the risk of going public? What kind of private line must be crossed for her to step into the arena she hates most? And what exactly did Meghan touch? What did she try to take, record, edit, or reshape that made and conclude the only way to stop her was to expose her? Because once we move into the first incident, the story stops being about feelings. It becomes about a locked box, a paperclip, and a moment in a restricted archive that, if the documentary is telling the truth, is the night the mask slipped right in front of the one person inside that family who does not tolerate manipulation. And if that night happened the way and her witnesses describe it, then everything that followed, the interviews, the tears, the outrage, the claims of oppression, doesn't look like a cry for help. It looks like a preemptive escape from the truth. Let's begin where the documentary begins. Not in California, not on television, but inside a palace corridor that leads to a place you were never meant to hear about until now. The documentary doesn't rush into the palace first. It does something smarter. It starts with the illusion of control. Because if you want the audience to understand why a person panics, you first show them why that person believed they were untouchable. California, the film suggests, was not just a location. It was a mindset, a curated atmosphere, a place where Meghan could breathe in a kind of silence she never had inside the royal machine. Silence without protocol, without staff who reported upward, without corridors that remembered everything. That morning, she moved like someone who had finally won. Not because she had healed, but because she had escaped the only institution that could contradict her in real time, and more like staging. Not in a sinister way on the surface, just the small, quiet decisions that create an environment where nothing surprises you, where the world enters only when you allow it, where the narrative arrives through your phone on your schedule. And the key point is this. She believed she was still writing the next chapter. The documentary frames it as a moment of strategic confidence. The deals, the approvals, the momentum, everything aligned in a neat line that pointed toward one conclusion. Meghan would speak, the world would listen, and the royal family would once again be forced to respond from inside the box she had built around them. In her mind, she wasn't fighting anymore. She was producing a series here, a podcast there, a documentary she imagined as a weapon of legitimacy, something that would turn allegations into a brand, and brand into power. She had spent years learning what modern influence really is. Not access to palaces, but access to attention. And attention, when managed well, becomes authority. That was the plan. Control the terms. Control the timeline. Control the emotional framing. Turn every criticism into proof of persecution. Every question into a signal that she was brave, and every silence from the palace into an admission of guilt. The film lingers on that psychology because it matters. It explains why what happens next doesn't feel like bad news. It feels like a structural collapse. Then her phone vibrates once, then again with that relentless rhythm that signals something is wrong even before you read a single word. The documentary doesn't treat it like a normal interruption. It treats it like the first crack in a dam. At the same time, the outside noise begins. Not the distant hum of a wealthy neighborhood. Not a delivery, not a neighbor's dog. Voices overlapping, urgent, hungry. The sound of a crowd that has arrived for one reason, to extract a statement. Meghan freezes, not dramatically, but in the way people freeze when the reality outside suddenly moves faster than the reality they designed inside. Her first instinct isn't anger yet. It's confusion. Because confusion is what you feel when your model of the world stops matching what's happening. Why are they here? How they find out? What do they know? Then the publicist calls, and the voice on the other end isn't polished. It isn't controlled. It's shaken. The kind of fear professionals try very hard not to show, because fear is contagious. Turn on the television. Now, Meghan's first reaction, the film implies, is dismissal. Not because she's calm, but because she can't imagine the institution she left would attack in a way she didn't anticipate. And that right there is the fatal misunderstanding. People assume the royal family fights with pomp, not precision. They assume if the palace responds, it responds slowly. They assume the monarchy is too restrained, too tradition-bound, too cautious to strike first. Princess, and the documentary suggests, is the exception. When the publicist says it when he finally forces the words out, the shock is not the BBC name itself. It's what the BBC represents. A megaphone with the authority Meghan cannot easily dismiss as hostile tabloids. It's the wrong platform for her usual defense. It's the wrong enemy for her usual script. A documentary led by Princess and is airing, and it's exposing you. Exposing you, not disagreeing with you, not debating you, not responding, exposing. The film understands the psychological impact of that word. It is the difference between a fight and a reveal. Meghan moves fast now. Fast in the way people move when their body has decided panic is necessary. She opens the laptop. She searches. She finds the headline, and there it is. Blunt and merciless. A promise that this time the story won't be framed by emotion. It will be framed by record. Then comes the second hit. Not a headline, an email. A subject line that functions like a guillotine. Termination of cooperation agreement. This is where the documentary lets the silence do its work. Because that email is not just about money. It's about legitimacy. It's about being cut loose by the very machine she believed would amplify her. It signals that something in the documentary is not merely embarrassing. It is operationally dangerous. The type of dangerous that triggers legal teams. The type of dangerous that makes corporations retreat before the public even finishes watching. And now the calm is gone. Not because the house is noisy, but because the illusion that she controls what happens next has been shattered. Meghan calls the publicist back, and her voice changes. There's an edge now, sharp, urgent, almost offended, as if reality has broken a rule. What the hell is going on? And the answer she receives in the documentary's framing is the moment the audience truly leans forward. She has proof. Proof. And it's all public now. That line is the hinge of the entire story because it tells you the war isn't being fought on interpretation anymore. It's being fought on whether Meghan can survive facts. The documentary doesn't let the viewer rest. It doesn't allow a soft transition. It immediately forces the next question. If, and has proof strong enough to trigger cancellations and panic before Meghan even speaks, what is in that file? And why didn't wait until this exact moment to open it? Because the next sequence, the film warns, is not about California at all. It's about a door inside the palace that should never have been opened, a lock that should never have been touched, and a loyal staff member who, after decades of silence, finally says, "I saw her inside." And once that sentence exists, the story stops being a PR battle. It becomes an incident report, and we are about to walk straight into it. The most effective exposes do not start by telling you what to think. They start by changing what you are allowed to doubt. That is exactly what this documentary does in its third movement. It tightens its language. It narrows its focus. It stops circling the public debate and walks straight into a single ruthless premise. For years, Meghan's story has survived because it lived in the soft space between competing narratives. Her version, the palace's silence, the public's projection, and the media's endless appetite for ambiguity. Princess Anne's documentary is built to destroy that space. It does it by reframing the entire conflict in one sentence, delivered not with drama, but with the chill of procedure. The real Meghan bears no resemblance to the image she has presented and continues to present to the public. That line matters because it is not just an insult. It is a declaration of intent. It tells you the documentary will not argue about feelings. It will argue about behavior. And then it makes the second move more dangerous than the first. It claims motive. It claims the palace is not dealing with a misunderstood outsider. It is dealing with someone who understands exactly how to weaponize modern attention, how to cry on cue, how to redirect blame, how to cast suspicion onto others, and how to construct a narrative that becomes truth simply because it is repeated loudly enough for long enough. The documentary structure here is deliberate. It knows the audience has been trained to treat every royal controversy as a culture war of opinions. You either believe Meghan or you believe the palace. So it removes that framework and replaces it with something the public cannot scroll past so easily. Witnesses, footage, recordings, a chain of events, a pattern, and a moment she calls without hesitation a criminal act. This is where the film's tone becomes unmistakable. It does not sound like royal gossip. It sounds like an institution finally deciding that silence is no longer protective. It is permissive. and does not speak like a woman defending her pride. She speaks like a custodian defending a boundary. And that boundary is privacy, not the casual privacy of celebrities who complain about cameras while calling photographers. The hard privacy of a constitutional family that survives only by keeping certain doors shut. The documentary frames, and as someone who has lived inside that system long enough to recognize one truth. Once you normalize intrusions, you are no longer protecting a family. You are collapsing an institution. That is why the film suggests her threshold is different. She can tolerate bad manners. She can tolerate ambition. She can tolerate people disliking her. What she cannot tolerate is covert recording, covert access, and covert manipulation. In other words, violations that leave evidence. And in the documentary's logic, Meghan did not merely make mistakes. She crossed lines that the royal family does not forgive because those lines are what keep the system intact. The film then does a subtle but powerful thing. It introduces a witness whose social status makes him almost invisible to the public and therefore, in the viewer's mind, unusually credible. Not a duke, not a duchess, not a press secretary, a staff member, a man who has served for decades, a man who does not need attention and has nothing to sell. The documentary gives him a name. It gives him history. It gives him a reputation for loyalty. And in doing so, it gives him weight. Because if you want people to believe a claim this explosive, you don't introduce it through a narrator with a dramatic voice. You introduce it through someone who looks like he would rather be anywhere else than on camera. His testimony is presented as plain, minimal, almost reluctant, and that reluctance is strategic, whether intentional or not, because reluctance reads like truth. He describes a corridor that leads to a restricted archive associated with the late Princess Diana. Even a mention of Diana's name changes the temperature in the room. Diana is not a normal subject inside this family. She's not just memory. She is myth, wound, and leverage all at once. And the documentary understands what the audience feels instinctively. Anything linked to Diana is not curiosity. It is sacred ground, which is why the next detail lands like a siren. The door was slightly open. It should not have been. No one was supposed to be there, but someone was. The witness says he saw Meghan inside, not outside, hesitating, not passing by, confused, inside, searching, frantic, looking for something. At this point, the documentary does not pile on. It doesn't need to. It lets the viewer's imagination do the work. And imagination is always more compelling than exposition. What would you be looking for? Why would she be alone? What did she think she would find? Then the documentary pivots back to Princess, and you can feel the mechanics of the trap closing, and recounts arriving at the archive room. She describes the door being ajar. She describes seeing Meghan kneeling, her back turned, holding a locked box, and then it introduces the object that becomes the documentary's central symbol of intent, a straightened paperclip. Not a key, not permission, not an accident. A tool. A crude tool. Yes, but a tool designed for one purpose, to force open what was never meant to be opened. And now the documentary's thesis is no longer abstract. It is physical. It is metal unlock. It is access without consent. It is the difference between I was curious and I was breaking in. This is also where Anne's portrayal becomes crucial to the viewer's acceptance, and is not framed as someone who enjoys confrontation. She is framed as someone who avoids it unless the cost of avoiding it becomes greater than the cost of speaking. So when she says she raised her voice when she describes herself screaming, your brain flags it as abnormal. And abnormal behavior from a normally controlled person signals a breaking point. What do you think you were doing? It is not theatrical. It is disbelief. And then, according to the documentary, Meghan does what the film has been building towards since the beginning. She changes her face. In a single instant, the panic is replaced by tears. And those tears are not presented as an emotional response. They are presented as a tactic because what follows is the move that in Anne's framing makes the act not merely intrusive, but reprehensible. Meghan points to the staff member and accuses him. She claims he was the one trying to break into the box. She claims she was trying to stop him. This is where the documentary forces the viewer into a moral corner. You cannot interpret that as misunderstanding. That is not a miscommunication. That is a direct attempt to transfer guilt from yourself to a person with far less power than you. And when, in response, she does not argue in circles. She delivers a statement that functions like a judicial ruling. She watched it happen. She saw the paperclip. She saw who held it. And she refuses to let the accusation stand. Then comes the most important operational detail in this entire section, because it signals the documentary will not remain in story mode. It will move into proof mode and order security. She demands footage. She wants every corridor camera immediately. That line does two things at once. It tells the viewer and expects the evidence to confirm what she saw, and it tells the viewer Meghan understands that too, because at the moment CCTV enters the narrative, the story stops being about who is persuasive. It becomes about who is recorded. And the documentary ends this movement on the precise note that keeps retention high. Not closure, but inevitability. Meghan goes still, not because she is caught in an argument, because she is caught in a system of cameras, protocols, and institutional memory. And from that moment forward, the documentary suggests an invisible barrier forms, one made not of gossip or dislike, but of irreversible mistrust. Because if the first major incident is true, then everything Meghan does afterward must be read through a new lens. Not as a person trying to survive the palace, but as a person trying to outrun the record. And that is exactly where the documentary takes us next, away from the archive and into a quieter scene where the betrayal is even colder. Not the opening of a box, but the capturing of a voice. If the archive incident is the moment the documentary claims Meghan crossed a physical line, then the next sequence is where it claims she crossed a moral one. Because you can argue about doors and locks. You can spin that into curiosity, confusion, even a misunderstanding if you are skilled enough with language. But you cannot easily defend one thing inside a royal environment where privacy is not a preference, but a rule of survival. Recording the sovereign without consent, the documentary moves to Balmoral with a deliberate shift in temperature. Everything slows down. The pace becomes quieter, almost reverent. Not because it's trying to flatter the monarchy, but because it wants the viewer to feel the weight of the space Meghan was entering, what it represents, who it belongs to, and how much of it depends on restraint. This was not a public engagement, not a ceremony, not a performance. It was afternoon tea, private, small, controlled, the kind of moment that matters inside royal life precisely because it is not for the cameras. The late Queen, the film reminds you, could spend her entire existence on display. So, these private rooms and private hours were the only places where she could be simply human, and the documentary makes a point of showing Meghan playing the part perfectly. She listens closely. She nods at the right moments. She smiles with the appropriate warmth. She reacts with that soft, emotional tone that signals empathy. On the surface, she looks exactly like the image she has sold the public. Attentive, sensitive, grateful. That is the trap, because the documentary's claim is not that Meghan didn't know how to behave. It is that she did, and she used that skill as camouflage. Princess, and sits nearby, and the film frames her attention in a different way. She isn't watching the Queen. She isn't watching Meghan's face for social cues. She's watching the small logistics that reveal intent. Where the handbag goes, where the phone goes, how the body angles around it. The documentary then focuses on a detail so specific it feels designed to stick in your memory. A faint red glow, and says she saw it reflected briefly in polished metal on the table. Small enough that most people would miss it. Familiar enough that someone who has lived around security and staff would recognize it immediately. Recording. Active. The phone face down as if hiding the screen, but the recording indicator still betraying its purpose. The documentary does not linger on the technicalities. It doesn't need to. The implication is clear. This was not a casual note-taking moment. It was an act of capture. And in that room, capture is violence, not physical violence. Institutional violence, the theft of something private and the conversion of it into an asset. And the documentary says does not confront Meghan in front of the Queen. That restraint matters because it signals discipline. It suggests Anne's priority isn't humiliation, it's containment. She refuses to turn a private meeting into a scene. So, she does something else instead. Something subtle enough to look accidental, but precise enough to be a test. She tips her cup. Tea moves. The phone is forced into motion. And in that small movement, Meghan loses control of the concealment. The red indicator is visible, unmistakable. The documentary emphasizes the psychological beat here. Meghan's first response is not embarrassment, it's speed. She grabs the device. She shuts it down. And then almost instantly, she smiles. Not a nervous smile, a practiced smile. The expression of someone who believes she can disarm a threat with charm. Her explanation arrives quickly, polished and sweet. She only wanted to save the Queen's advice because the words were so meaningful, so wise, so difficult to remember. The documentary does not argue with that explanation directly. It does something more damning. It lets him stare. No reaction, no acceptance, just a cold, steady gaze that communicates one message without speech. I understand what you're doing, and I do not believe you. The camera, the narration, the pacing, everything in this sequence is built around a single theme. Performance versus intent. Meghan is performing attentiveness while allegedly taking something that does not belong to her, and is performing calm while allegedly preparing to close a door that has been opened too far. The documentary then gives a line that functions like a diagnostic assessment, not a personal insult. She is a manipulator and says bluntly. She knows precisely how to steer situations so that use is designed to persuade whoever is listening. This is not casual character commentary. His narrative stops being about what and suspects and becomes about what and overhears. But before it reaches that corridor, it locks the viewer into the moral logic of the documentary's argument. Inside that tea room, Meghan was not just breaking protocol. She was collecting the one thing the monarchy cannot afford to have turned into content: the sovereign's private voice. And if that voice was captured with intent, then the next step is obvious. Not to remember it, to use it. And that is exactly where the documentary goes next. Because an accidental recording can be excused, a deliberate plan to manipulate that recording cannot. After the tea, the film shifts into a colder, tighter rhythm, less reflective, more operational, like the moment an institution stops asking what if and starts asking how far did this go. Balmoral's corridors are described as long and quiet, lined with portraits that watch without expression. The documentary leans into that atmosphere, not for Gothic drama, but for one reason: to underline how exposed you become in a place built on silence. Every footstep echoes, every voice carries, every mistake becomes audible. And Meghan, according to the documentary, makes the mistake that reveals everything. She walks through that corridor, speaking on her phone, animated, energized, almost giddy with the confidence of someone who believes she has just secured a powerful asset, not a memory, not a sentimental recording, a tool. Her words, as presented in the film, are not the language of admiration. They're the language of production, editing, targeting, impact. "I've got it," she says, implying she now possesses a recording of the Queen's words. Then she delivers the line that the documentary treats as the moral smoking gun. Instructions to cut the recording up, to shape it, to turn it into something usable against the palace. In that single beat, the documentary's argument becomes brutally simple. This was never about remembering advice. This was about manufacturing a weapon. And the audience can feel why that distinction matters. Because a recorded private voice can be rearranged. A sentence can be isolated. A pause can be removed. Emotion can be reframed. Meaning can be inverted. A human voice, once captured, can be made to say almost anything when the editor's motive is not truth, but leverage. The documentary pauses here long enough for the implication to settle. If you can distort the sovereign's private words, you can distort the sovereign's public legitimacy. And in an institution built on legitimacy, that is not gossip, that is a threat. Then it reveals the detail that turns the corridor call from a private confession into a witnessed event. And is there not as a rumor, not as a later interpretation, present, listening, and not alone. Thomas is with her. The documentary frames their presence as quiet confirmation. This is no longer one person's claim against another person's denial. This is now a moment that exists outside Meghan's control. Thomas's reaction is described as disbelief, less outraged than stunned, as if his mind cannot reconcile the performance he's witnessed at the tea table with the intent he is now hearing in the corridor. That disbelief is important. It's the psychological mirror for the audience. The viewer is meant to feel the same thing. The sudden shift from maybe to Owen steps out of the shadows, and her voice changes the room without raising volume. That is the key to her authority in this documentary. She doesn't need intensity. She needs precision. "Meghan, stop," she says, calm enough to be terrifying. The film makes it clear and is not asking. She is taking control of the situation the way she always has, direct, procedural, almost clinical. And when Meghan turns startled, her first instinct is not apology, it is performance. She pivots into politeness, into the soft tone of someone offering compliance without offering admission. She asks if and wishes to advise her, as though the issue is a misunderstanding that can be smoothed over with etiquette, and doesn't accept the framing. She moves closer and speaks with bluntness that feels intentionally unglamorous, words chosen not to entertain, but to define a boundary. Within these walls, privacy is sacred. The documentary lingers on that phrase because it is doing more than scolding Meghan. It is explaining the monarchy's operating system. It is telling the audience, you cannot understand this conflict if you don't understand this rule. And then states the charge clearly, recording the Queen without consent, whatever the claimed intention, constitutes a betrayal of trust. And then she introduces the most chilling element of the entire exchange, consequence. She suggests certain laws could interpret this kind of behavior in the most serious terms. The documentary uses that language not to make a legal argument in detail, but to deliver psychological weight. This is bigger than manners. This is bigger than family conflict. This is about acts that institutions treat as existential. Meghan flinches. The film emphasizes that flinch because it signals recognition. She understands the difference between criticism she can spin and a charge she cannot charm away. And then she does what the documentary has been building towards since the archive scene. She becomes the victim. Her voice sharpens. Her posture changes. Confusion appears on command. She implies she's being targeted. She suggests she's being suppressed because she is an outsider. She insists she only admired the Queen. She attempts to drag and into an emotional argument where intent becomes unknowable and accountability dissolves into feelings, and refuses the invitation. Her response is stripped of warmth. I've said what needed to be said, not a debate, not a discussion, a warning. The documentary closes the exchange with, and turning away, her footsteps described as firm and final, leaving Meghan standing alone with something the film wants you to feel as the true beginning of her fear, not fear of gossip, fear of exposure. Because after that corridor call, the documentary's logic is unavoidable. If Meghan was willing to record, willing to edit, willing to weaponize, then everything that happens next is not a misunderstanding escalating. It is a strategy accelerating. And Meghan's next move, the film claims, was to strike first before the evidence could catch her. Because once Meghan realizes and has seen too much and heard too much, the film argues she does the only thing a narrative-driven strategist can do when evidence there threatens to surface. She floods the space with a different story. Not tomorrow, not after reflection, immediately. The documentary frames this as Meghan's core advantage and her fatal flaw at the same time. Her advantage is speed. Her flaw is that speed makes her predictable. She doesn't sit with risk. She doesn't wait for facts to settle. She outruns the moment with volume. And volume for a while can sound like truth. According to the film, Meghan does not start by calling a traditional public relations team. She doesn't route it through official channels where advice would be cautious and paper trails would form. She bypasses the standard machinery and goes straight to the ecosystem that rewards scandal without asking for proof. Media activists, regional public relations executives who thrive on outrage, people whose careers are built on exposes that are really emotional narratives stitched into headlines. The documentary's tone here is not speculative. It speaks as though this network is known, mapped, almost predictable, like a pipeline that can be activated with a few calls and the right emotional script. And Meghan, it suggests, knows exactly what script works. She calls them with a voice designed to sound shaken. Not too composed, or it looks rehearsed. Not too chaotic, or it looks unstable. The perfect middle zone, fragile enough to trigger protective instincts, coherent enough to be quoted, and she gives them what they need. A frame. It's them. Now I did something wrong. Not I crossed a line. It's them. Then she releases the story the public has heard in different versions ever since. Palace life as toxic, suffocating, conspiratorial, a machine of internal power struggles, an environment where staff betray each other, a place ruled by fear, a system that crushes anyone who does not obey its codes. The documentary does something clever here. It doesn't deny that palaces can be harsh. It doesn't claim institutions are gentle. Instead, it claims Meghan used the plausibility of institutional coldness as camouflage because a believable backdrop makes a fabricated plot easier to sell. And then she names the enemy inside that plot, Princess Anne, in Meghan's version, and isn't a disciplined royal trying to protect boundaries. She becomes the antagonist, the oppressor, the figure who targets her, undermines her, and uses an inner circle to spread stories designed to damage her mental and physical health. The documentary argues this is not random blame. It is a strategic choice, and is respected for being unsentimental and incorruptible. If Meghan can paint even as cruel, then the institution looks rotten at its core. If the hardest royal is framed as a bully, the rest of the family becomes easy prey. So Meghan pushes it further. She doesn't just leak complaints, she announces ambitions. She turns the narrative into a product because products create permanence. They turn allegations into content, and content becomes cultural memory. A streaming series, a podcast, an unfiltered truth campaign. The documentary frames this as the moment Meghan commits to the most dangerous tactic in modern media, manufacturing a conclusion before evidence can arrive. Because when you fill the world with a story first, any later contradiction can be dismissed as retaliation. Any proof becomes framing. Any criticism becomes suppression. And the more you repeat that frame, the more the audience learns to interpret reality through it. This is how narrative warfare works. You don't win by being correct. You win by being early, emotional, and relentless. The documentary then accelerates the pace to show the consequence of that strategy. Headlines multiply. The language becomes uniform. Toxic palace, bullied duchess, brave truth teller, royal oppression. Commentators repeat the claims as if repetition itself is verification. Social media fractures into teams. The public demands statements. Advisors panic. The palace communication machine begins its familiar slow grind. Cautious, restrained, legal-minded. And Meghan, the film claims, watches it all with satisfaction. Not because she enjoys pain, but because chaos is useful. Chaos creates fog. Fog hides details. And details are where evidence lives. The documentary's portrayal of Meghan here is sharp. It suggests she saw the royal family less as family and more as a brand asset, an institution whose weight could be leveraged to elevate her own profile, her own business. It was the platform she extracted value from. And for a time, it worked. The documentary wants the viewer to acknowledge that uncomfortable truth. The strategy succeeded because the world is built to reward spectacle. A crying interview moves faster than a legal memo, waiting for the public to absorb the performance, waiting until the moment when the evidence would not be buried beneath the noise, but would land on top of it like a verdict. The documentary calls this patience. It calls it discipline. It calls it the quality Meghan lacked. And then it drops the line that turns the entire conflict from a messy feud into a controlled trap. Meghan played every card she had and kept one decisive card in silence. That is where part 6 ends right on the edge of impact. Because now the question is no longer whether Meghan's accusations were loud. The question is whether they can survive what and is about to release. And according to the documentary, when that release comes, it doesn't arrive as an opinion. It arrives as a dose. In modern media, the person who stays quiet is assumed to be guilty until the quiet person speaks with proof. Princess, and the film argues, understood that rule better than anyone. And she understood something else, even more important. If you answer noise with noise, you do not win. You only confirm that the battle is about volume. So, and did the one thing Meghan's entire strategy depends on never happening. She refused to chase the narrative. She refused to react on Meghan's schedule. She refused to enter the emotional arena where tears, accusations, and insinuations can live forever without needing to be verified. Instead, she built a file. And the documentary frames that file not as vengeance, but as containment, an institutional response to what and describes as a pattern of intrusion, manipulation, and narrative engineering. This section begins with and explaining the logic of her restraint in simple, almost clinical terms. If she had released footage immediately, Meghan would have turned it into evidence of bullying and attack by the palace against a vulnerable outsider. The story would not have been, look at what happened. The story would have been, look at what they're doing to her. The footage would have been swallowed by the larger drama Meghan was already feeding. So and waited, not passively, not helplessly, deliberately. The documentary emphasizes what that waiting looked like behind the scenes. Verification, witness preparation, retrieval of security records, confirmation of timelines, quiet consultation with legal and security teams. The film does not dwell on the bureaucracy, but it signals something crucial for credibility. And response was not emotional. It was methodical, and methodical responses do not arrive as interviews. They arrive as DOS. The documentary then turns that strategic patience into a psychological contrast, because contrast is what keeps audiences engaged. It sets Anne and Meghan on two different rails. Meghan moves fast. She speaks. She leaks. She performs. She escalates. She tries to dominate the story every day, forcing the palace to either respond or look complicit. And moves slow. She observes. She documents. She waits for the precise moment when the evidence will land with maximum force and minimum ambiguity. The film presents it as a mismatch in discipline. Meghan, it claims, is addicted to control. She cannot tolerate silence, because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates fear. And, by contrast, is comfortable in silence, because silence is how institutions protect themselves. Silence is how you keep private matters from becoming public weapons until the weapon is pointed at you. And then silence becomes liability. That pivot when silence becomes liability is the documentary's turning point. The film suggests and did not want a media war. She did not enjoy the idea of broadcasting family conflict. She knew the monarchy is damaged by controversy even when it wins. But she also knew there is a moment when restraint stops being dignity and starts being surrender. And Meghan, the documentary implies, pushed the institution to that moment. The more Meghan spoke, the more she positioned herself as the only truth teller. The more she claimed oppression, the more she created a moral trap. Anyone who contradicted her would look like an aggressor. And solution was to bypass morality theater entirely. She would not argue that Meghan was lying. She would demonstrate it. The documentary uses language here that is carefully chosen to feel final. It calls Anne's objective a clear and final resolution. Not closure in the emotional sense, closure in the legal sense. A line drawn, a record established, a narrative ended. And then it explains why the broadcast happens when it does. Because timing is the real weapon in this conflict. And did not release her evidence at the peak of Meghan's accusations. She waited until Meghan had repeated the same frame so often that the public began to treat it as a reflex. Meghan speaks, palace oppresses. Then, and chose the moment to break the reflex. The documentary frames it as a trap built from the very thing Meghan relied on. Meghan's pattern was predictable. Accuse, amplify, monetize. Accuse, amplify, monetize. and waited for the pattern to complete itself until Meghan had publicly committed to the story as product, until Meghan had tied her reputation, her deals, and her future projects to the credibility of her claims. And only then did and move. Because once the narrative becomes a product, evidence doesn't just challenge your story. It threatens your livelihood. It triggers corporate risk. It activates legal departments. It makes platforms and brands ask a question they hate asking too late. What do we attach ourselves to? This is why the documentary suggests the fallout hits Meghan so fast. Not because companies suddenly grow consciences, because companies fear association with provable deception. And understood that too, and she used it. The film then tightens the focus back onto Anne's tone, because tone is part of why this section holds attention, and is portrayed as untheatrical. She doesn't sound triumphant. She sounds tired, resolved, as if she has watched a pattern repeat too many times and decided that the only mercy left is clarity. She says in effect, I anticipated her strategy. I knew she would try to outrun the truth. I knew she would weaponize victimhood before anyone could test her claims. And I knew that if I responded too early, the public would not see evidence, they would see cruelty. So I waited, and the documentary makes the audience feel the weight of that waiting by hinting at what it cost. Weeks, months, perhaps longer of headlines, speculation, reputational erosion, and public division. This is a crucial retention mechanism. It makes the audience ask, if Anne endured all that noise on purpose, what exactly was she holding? What evidence could be worth that much patience? What proof would justify breaking royal restraint on a public broadcaster? And that is how Part 7 ends. Not with the evidence itself, but with the promise of a controlled detonation. Because the documentary is preparing to do what Meghan's entire media strategy tries to prevent. It is about to replace a narrative with a record. It is about to make the audience stop debating and start watching. And once that happens, the documentary suggests there is no way back. Because in a world addicted to storytelling, the only thing stronger than a story is a receipt. Up to this point, the film has been doing what high-retention storytelling does best. It creates a psychological corridor the viewer cannot exit. It establishes motive, pattern, escalation, and timing so that when the evidence arrives, it does not feel like a random reveal. It feels inevitable, and then it delivers the first strike in a way that is designed to remove debate, not provoke it. Princess and does not introduce the footage with flourish. She introduces it with a sentence that functions like a legal foundation. This is what happened. This is who was there. This is how we know. The documentary then drops into the archive incident again, but now it claims it is no longer asking you to imagine it. It is showing you. Security footage is presented as the backbone of this chapter, not for drama, but for authority. The film understands a basic truth about modern audiences. People distrust commentary, but they trust a timestamp. They distrust emotion, but they trust a corridor camera. They distrust claims, but they trust a person physically walking into a restricted space. The documentary frames the footage as clear enough to establish the central point. Meghan enters the restricted area. Meghan is present where she should not be. Meghan is not accompanied by staff authorized to access that archive. The film's argument becomes brutally simple. Access happened. Intrusion happened. And once intrusion is established, everything that follows becomes about intent and reaction. This is where Thomas becomes more than a witness. He becomes the moral anchor. His testimony is positioned as restrained and almost painful because it is not flattering to him. It does not make him powerful. It makes him vulnerable. The film shows that he is not volunteering drama. He is forced into it because someone with vastly more public influence allegedly tried to destroy him with a lie. He describes the moment Meghan pointed at him. He describes the shock of being accused of theft and betrayal inside an institution he served for decades. And the documentary uses his reaction as a mirror. The audience feels the same kind of disbelief, the same cold anger that comes when you see power turn on a weaker person to avoid accountability. Then, Anne returns to the key detail, the paperclip, not as a tabloid prop, but as a symbol of method. The film frames it as the difference between being somewhere you shouldn't be and doing something you shouldn't do. Because the paperclip is not passive. It is an instrument. And in the documentary's logic, instruments imply intention. The narrative tightens again and introduces the second layer of evidence not to pile on, but to prove pattern. Two female palace employees appear not to gossip, to testify. Their stories are framed as small, personal, and devastatingly familiar to anyone who understands workplace manipulation, triangulation. According to their accounts, Meghan approached each of them separately with a friendly tone and a supportive posture, then claimed she had heard the other employee criticizing them, questioning their performance, doubting their competence. It is the classic seed of distrust. It forces people to become defensive. It creates tension that can later be labeled toxic environment. The documentary's argument here is precise. If you need evidence of an oppressive workplace, but none exists, you can manufacture it by engineering conflict and then pointing at the conflict as proof. Both employees, the film says, confirm they never made those statements about each other. Both describe confusion, hurt, and the slow, dawning realization that they were being positioned against one another. This is an important retention beat because it expands the case beyond a single explosive incident. It tells the viewer the archive and the tea are not isolated. They belong to a broader toolkit. Divide, redirect, weaponize. Then the documentary delivers what it treats as the decisive blow. Audio, because footage shows where someone was. Audio shows what someone intended. And intent is where moral judgment crystallizes. The film introduces an audio clip of Meghan speaking to a media activist, her voice trembling as if she is crying, describing suppression, fear, deteriorating mental health, and danger within the palace. On its own, that clip could reinforce Meghan's public narrative. That is the documentary's point. This is the kind of material that becomes viral and unquestionable when the audience has no counterframe. But the documentary does not play it alone. It pairs it. It follows with a second audio clip presented as recorded in the corridor where Meghan allegedly instructs someone to edit, cut, and shape the Queen's words into a weapon. The power of this sequencing is not subtle. It forces the viewer into a specific interpretation. The victim voice is not spontaneous truth. It is a tool deployed for effect. The documentary wants the audience to feel the difference between suffering and performance. Not because suffering is impossible, but because performance can imitate suffering so well that it becomes indistinguishable unless you see behind it. Anne's commentary in this section is framed as controlled and unyielding. She does not claim Meghan is evil in a cartoon sense. She claims Meghan is skilled, strategic, able to switch faces, able to move from panic to tears to outrage with speed that indicates rehearsal, not overwhelm. And then lands the central verdict of the documentary's case. Meghan repeatedly claimed victimhood while producing no substantiated evidence, and by contrast presents witnesses and records. The documentary's argument is now complete. It is no longer asking the public to choose who feels more believable. It is asking the public to choose whether they can ignore what they have heard and seen. This is where the film escalates to its most dangerous implication without saying it outright. If Meghan's narrative was built through media activism, edited recordings, and manufactured workplace conflict, then the public has not simply been watching a personal feud. They have been consuming a constructed reality. And once you suspect you've been fed a constructed reality, your anger doesn't remain pointed at the institution anymore. It flips toward the storyteller. That flip public sympathy reversing direction is the documentary's real climax. And Part 8 ends by preparing the final sequence. Not the evidence which has already landed, but the consequence. Because in the modern world, exposure does not end with embarrassment. It ends with contracts, platforms, brands, and the speed at which an image can collapse when the market decides it is too risky to carry.